Working Cows Podcast, episode 385. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature some of the world's leading regenerative ag and adaptive grazing experts on our show. And many of those experts are farmer, rancher instructors from the nonprofit Soil Health Academy. This year, you'll have several opportunities to experience and profit from attending one of their remarkable on-farm schools and workshops. Whether you're interested in learning more about diversifying corn and bean rotations to increase profitability, merging multiple species and marketing, grazing on the high plains and in northern environments, regenerative farming and ranching, or enhancing profits and production in your beef or dairy operation, the Soil Health Academy has a school for you. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself. So visit soilhealthacademy.org to learn more and register. Financial assistance scholarships are available. Very excited to be joined today by two of those consultants and two of the instructors of the Soil Health Academy, Kent Solberg, Jeremy Sweeten, both of them longtime practitioners of these concepts and ideas. Always a privilege to talk to the crew over at Understanding Ag, and today we're going to talk about the process, the ins and the outs, and the concerns and advantages and challenges of outwintering cattle. Jeremy, Kent, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Yeah, hi Clay, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah,
good to see you again.
Yeah, good to have you guys both back. I had you on separately before, and talk to you just kind of about the different things that you guys had going on in your context. And Kent, you're in Minnesota. What part of Minnesota are you in?
Yeah, northwest Minnesota.
Okay, so like how far north?
You know, if you know Minnesota, we're halfway between Brainerd and Detroit Lakes.
Okay,
and Detroit Lakes is east of Fargo and
yep,
northwest of St. Cloud. If you know Minnesota at all.
Yep. My sister-in-law lives in Perham, so
very good. Yeah, not far from Perham.
Yep. So, and then Jeremy, you're in the Upper Peninsula, right?
Correct. We're the east end of the Upper Peninsula, very east end of Lake Superior.
Sure. Yep. So, both fairly cold and humid contexts. I have never been to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I've only been in extreme southern Michigan. So, but from my understanding, both humid and cold contexts. Would that be accurate description?
Yeah, and we're 120 to 140 inches of snow a year.
Yeah, that's a challenge. And when does it come? Jeremy, when does the snow come?
Anywhere from November 15th to Christmas.
Yep. And then when does it leave?
Anywhere from early April to May.
Right. Yep.
So our grazing season is shorter than our overwintering season.
Yep. And we're similar here in western South Dakota, probably not as reliably snow covered as either one of you, I would guess, just given the fact that we're in a drier environment. And but from my experience the last couple of years, just trying to observe and notice what I'm noticing, I don't think a lack of snow cover is always an advantage either from a soil health perspective. Would you guys agree with that? That snow cover on the ground does good things for ground in the wintertime?
Yeah, actually, Lane Ingham's done some research, and some of the most biologically active soil is that layer between the ground itself and the snow. She found just huge populations of microorganisms there during the winter months. We think everything goes dormant and dead, but there's a lot going on there, even at sub-zero temperatures.
Yeah. If you can keep it able to continue to have
keep it covered.
Right.
Yep.
So very good. So yeah, that's kind of the reason I'm setting all this context up is because that's kind of our topic for the day is outwintering cattle. And I don't know, I think the first time I ever heard that term was when I talked to Bob Havard about it, way back in the late 90s episodes, I think, of the Working Cows podcast, and he's from England. And so I've come to kind of realize that east of the 100th meridian, our terminology is a lot more influenced by England, and then west of the 100th meridian, our terminology is a lot more influenced by Spanish traditions. And so we have ranches here, you have farms there, right? And that's so the outwintering isn't something I'd heard before talking to Bob Havard about it, but it is basically the idea of keeping cattle out. What would be normal? What would be the way that the paradigm has been managed thus far?
Yeah, great question. It depends on the context in a very large way. I learned about outwintering from two gentlemen from southeast Minnesota in the late 90s, Art Tickey, who was a dairy farmer, and Ralph Lenz, who was a beef farmer. Ralph has since passed away. I believe Art's still around. And both of them, both a dairy herd and a beef herd, were doing this in not far from the Iowa border in southeast Minnesota back in the 90s. And they would travel the countryside teaching people how to do this and that it can be done and answering questions. This is back in the days before PowerPoint. They had a slide deck under their arm, if you remember those old carousel slide decks. And they would talk particularly about bale grazing. Outwintering is a very, very broad spectrum of options and opportunities on how to keep cattle throughout the winter. Some of the other early sort of adopters include University of Minnesota out at their West Central Research Station in Morris. Dennis Johnson started it there after having some discussions with literally some dairy farmers who were doing it also in the late 90s in Minnesota. And they've been doing it for almost 30 years now. And it's kind of become their preferred way of keeping their dairy herd, their dry cows, their bred heifers over the winter. So it's pretty powerful. The beauty we have in the North Country here, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, is we get this 4 or 5 months of free concrete every year. And so, we can pack things in a little tighter. We can do some different things than we can in, say, the fescue belt of, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland. And not that it can't be done there. We'll get into that. But it's very much context driven. Same when we get into arid areas of, eastern Montana, Idaho, the high desert country. There's things we can do there just because it's dry and it can handle the traffic automatically. So let's start with the North Country on some of the ideas and options there and move into more of that fescue belt, because there are different considerations and things to think about. It's not uncommon. It's pretty common to see people, pre-place bales, and this is where the term bale grazing comes from. Outwintering is a whole bunch of things. It can be unrolling hay. I know people who unroll hay. I know people who pre-place and bale graze. I know people that systematically feed TMR out in the snow in the winter. All of these are outwintering techniques. And so you have to think about your context. You have to think about what you're trying to accomplish on that site. I was part of a workshop last fall, and we had a breakout session on outwintering. And one of the things we did at the beginning of the breakout would ask people, what are you doing? What you been doing are you outwintering, and what are you using, and why are you using it? And one of the most exciting things, I guess, I heard, and this is from somebody who truly gets it and adapting to their context, he said, well, it depends on where I'm at on my farm. And he had a beef operation, and he said, if I have a site that I want to get a lot of fertility on in the winter, I'm going to pre-place bales, at 25 to 35 bales per acre, and I'm going to let them work that over pretty hard. He had a site that had a bunch of willows growing in, so he just jammed bales in there, and those cattle ate. They got to eat, they had a windbreak, and they beat the snot out of the brush. He was trying to accomplish several things there. And he said, if I've got other ground that's going to be hay ground and I want to be able to get in there and make hay the next year, I'll go in and unroll bales because I don't have, those little piles left over of bale residue that can be a bit of a nuisance, haying particularly that first year and sometimes the second year after bale grazing on it. So the context fits. Personally, I've unrolled bales, I've pre-placed bales, I've taken baleage out, I've done TMR, and it's just, it totally depends on what you want to accomplish, what's your context, what do you want to get out of it, what class animals you're feeding, all these things fit in. And, I encourage people not to just pick thinking one size is going to fit all. Think about what you want to do. Outwintering, no matter how we do it, is an amazing opportunity to build fertility, particularly on those poor performing sites. And then it's understanding, what's that site going to be used for the next year? If it's going to go into pasture, and I really don't want to be out there starting up a skid loader or a tractor or a pickup with a bale bed on it when it's 30 below zero or 40 below or the wind's screaming or a blizzard, and I can feed, 4, 5, 6 days out to 60. There's guys feeding 60 days at a time. They're putting all the bales out there, removing the twine, the net wrap, whatever, and just cutting them loose for the winter. If they're like, I want to keep this as low labor and least amount of hours on the machinery as possible, and I want a lot of fertility out there, then, hey, put those, round bales of dry hay out there and do that. That's great. All the more power to you. It's amazing what they can do and take care of themselves. But if it's a site that I'm going to use for hay next year or want to use from hay, then I'm probably going to run out there with the mixer wagon, and systematically spread across that, or I'm going to systematically unroll hay. I've known guys not far from me who use a lot of outwintering, but they almost always do it on hay ground, on rented hay ground, because that's about all the landowner will let them do. And they're fine with that. They want to go check these animals anyway, and they get set up to do that in the fall, and it works really well. So, think about your context, think about how you want to do it. When we get down into the fescue belt, Kentucky, Virginia, whatever, Maryland, where it doesn't freeze, Greg Halleck from University of Kentucky, Jeremy, or Kentucky State? I can't remember. University of Kentucky.
Yep.
He took the idea and modified it to work down there. And what he's doing is very low density bale placement, 4 to 5 bales an acre. It's working and no more than 30 days on any site, and then he moves them off, because if we get a warm up in February, that fescue is going to start to grow again, and he'll often put those bales out there on stockpile fescue so the animals have access to both. It distributes the traffic around. They're never on one site terribly long. Yes, there's a little bit of mudding up that happens, but because they're on there for short periods of time, because he pulls them off that particular paddock, or field after 30 days, any quote damage or perceived damage out there, by mid to late summer, you go back on those sites, you really don't see it anymore. So it's really about management. It's understanding your context and then determining what scenario you're going to use within all the different tools that are available within the toolbox of outwintering.
Yeah, for sure. And Jeremy, from your context, you talked about, quite a bit of snow. I think by anybody's metric, that's a lot of snow to compete with. So what have been some of the strategies that you've used and that you've seen work well in your context?
So one thing I want to say is we've learned to be very intentional with our situation and what we're doing. And also looking for those disruptions in our adaptive grazing system. How can we provide a disruption? Because like I mentioned at the beginning, our non-grazing season is longer than our grazing season. So we still want to build soils as we're going. So that's our intentionality. We do bale grazing where we're setting round bales on end. We use big squares. We feed silage hay. We pre-place natural twine wrapped round bales so we don't have to cut twine off. And we also graze stockpile. So we use any one of those methods. We normally don't feed the baleage until after freezing temperatures hit. And, we try to feed stockpile up until the snow gets too deep. And that's going to be a foot to 18 inches. You get animals really loitering around waiting for the skid loader to start at that point. But we also, part of our context is we're fall calving, so we don't want those mamas to have to work too hard for a living because we don't want the calf weight to suffer, especially at $3 stockers.
Yeah, so you're calving. We're talking end August here. You're calving now, right? Or
we hit the halfway point yesterday.
Yep.
So yeah.
And so you're coming into kind of early lactation in September, October, and then, kind of late lactation through the heart of the winter months, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll feed bale silage based on what the weather's going to do. If there's a storm coming in, we'll feed higher quality hay 48 hours ahead of time. When we see the white-tailed deer starting to come out and feed, which I picked this up from Kent, but also observed it on our place. When they start to feed, we start feeding good, high quality hay and place it where the animals will be out of the east wind. Sure. So, we're still moving cattle around the farm, even though the snow's deep. If we can pack down a path with our track skid loader, they'll follow feed anywhere.
Yeah. Jeremy started to bring it up. This full spectrum of outwintering even includes grazing stockpile, as well as grazing annual complex cover crops and corn stalks, and even standing corn. The guys in Alberta, there's a group of guys in Alberta that have really kind of mastered the strip grazing of corn stalks in the winter to keep costs down. We've got people grazing complex covers into January, February in Minnesota, North Dakota, places like that. And so this is all part of a sequence setting up basically a forage sequence or a grazing sequence. Most people, that's going to be start with stockpile, although down in the fescue belt, we do it a little different. I'll come back to that in a minute here, but, grazing that stockpile, maybe going to covers, maybe we've got some resprouted cereals that we added some cover crops to, look at what those opportunities are around you. And a lot of people get concerned about water. We've got guys in the Dakotas walking animals 1.25 miles back to water in the winter. In fact, one of our colleagues in central Minnesota, not this last winter, the winter before, actually successfully wintered his herd of beef cows without any running water. They basically lick snow. Now, you have to be careful. The snow has to be the right consistency and enough of it so they can meet their moisture requirements, their hydration requirements. But it can be done with good management. And he just wanted to see if he could do it, and he hit a kind of a perfect window to do it, and he made it happen. The last winter, we didn't have diddly for snow most of the winter. It wouldn't have worked with a hill of beans, but they can walk, and they will walk, and that's just fine. In fact, it's actually good for those spring calvers to get a little exercise in, just like the doctor tells us. We need our 10,000 steps a day in to stay healthy. It wouldn't hurt those mama cows to get their 10,000 steps a day in either when it comes to calving season come spring. So, I don't want to leave those things out. Everybody sort of automatically goes to the bale grazing thing, and we want to make sure we cover the whole spectrum here. And the more of these things you can put together, every day that cow can go out and get her own feed, we don't have to fire up a tractor. We don't have to fight the weather. We don't have to fight dead batteries and gelled up diesel engines. That's money in our pocket, folks. It really is. It's like, we're blessed right now with how high cattle prices and reasonably decent milk prices and very low feed prices. And I'd like to spend time on that because it ties into it. But, we can get a little sloppy, but this is the time to start setting up systems like this and building all these different opportunities into your management scenario throughout the year.
Yeah, for sure. And you guys, I asked John Haskell one time to pitch to me the advantages of ranching in the West where it gets dry. And he said, well, that's easy. We can store feed, because the feed quality holds through the winter in this part of the world. Is that true also in colder environments like Minnesota and Michigan? Do you guys have the cool season grasses that'll hold their feed value through the winter better than some of the other people? As a good friend of mine one time said, in Louisiana they don't grow grass, they grow tall water. So do you guys have those cool season grasses that'll hold their feed value through the winter?
We do start dropping in energy as we go through the winter. So, but most honestly right now in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, we're into our stockpile right now. In late August here, there's not enough recovery left in the fall because the days are getting shorter. Where we're at here, our average killing frost is October 1st. That's 40-ish days away from where we're at right now. So there's not enough recovery time. The amount of recovery diminishes as we get later in the fall with the shorter days, cooler temperatures, and so on. So we're into stockpile right now. And so unless you've got a lot of, for example, hay ground that you're not taking last crop hay off and you can get animals to, and you can add that to your stockpile, which is a great strategy. Encourage people to think about it. We're working on that stockpile now. And so, not many people are getting in much past the first week or so in December that I know at this latitude. On stockpile grass. That's when they're moving to the corn stalks, they're moving to the covers, they're moving to the resprouted cereals if you've got them in the fall. Those sort of things is what they start working on roughly Thanksgiving, first week of December on average. But boy, every day you can keep them out there, what a difference it makes. I did mention earlier a little different strategy in the fescue belt, and I want to touch on that. What a number of producers have gone to is they're building stockpile in September, October, November. They're doing bale grazing in September, October, November. So they have stockpile to graze because the palatability of that fescue goes up after a frost. They're going back and hitting that stockpile December, January, February. They're trying to build stockpile in the fall. So they'll flip their bale grazing around and use it as a tool to build fescue stockpile going into the winter. And that's a different twist on this. And it's a pretty important one to remember if you're in that part of the world.
Yeah, and I think I've heard from some people in that part of the world as well that the bale grazing areas are less prone to get muddy and plugged up and all those things, that you build that soil biology to the point that it can hold cattle up better than it would otherwise.
Yes,
for sure. So one other thing that I wanted to say, you mentioned the exercise portion of this. Dawn Natto was on talking about stockmanship one time, and she said that when she was in a feed yard that Bud Williams came to and he was working there, he kind of said, okay, you guys have this pen of cattle, you treat them the way you want to treat them. I'm going to take this pen of cattle and I'll treat them the way I want to treat them. And one of the things that he did with that pen of cattle is on a regular basis get them out of the pen and in the alleyways just to exercise them. And they vastly outperformed the ones that were always in the pen, and never got out for exercise. And so I think that's something that we don't think about. And I think part of that, especially in the winter, is if they're going to stand still and just stand there, they're going to burn a lot of energy just trying to stay warm. Whereas if they're moving, they're creating some of that heat themselves and not having to maybe burn as much to just to stay warm. So I think that's part of that as well.
You brought up burning energy, and if we could touch on that, Jeremy talked about pre-placing bales in front of a major storm to get them out of the wind and so on, and having there is importance still in having windbreaks and them having access to windbreaks. Do they need it every day? No. There are a handful of days where they're going to need it. And, all of us carry a device around or have a laptop or whatever in front of us. We can check the weather. We can see the fronts coming. We can connect multiple weather forecasters and have a pretty good idea when we think that storm's going to hit. And if we can manage accordingly for that, I've done things like have areas where there's a windbreak where when it's decent weather, I lock that gate. I don't even let them go in there. But when we know that weather's going to change and it's going to get nasty, I'll open that gate. You can throw some bedding down if you want for a few days, especially if that temperature's going to drop, and let them get access to that. And that can work really well. And again, it just really comes down to management, but identifying those areas going into it. Where can I park them? Where can I feed? Where can they go? What do they have access to, particularly to get out of that wind? And NDSU's done, their ag engineering department's done a really good job of designing windbreaks in order to get the maximum protection for those animals on the downwind side. Roughly 70 to 75% solid, 25 to 30% open. And with that, you can get wind protection out about 4 times the height of your windbreak. So let's say it's 10 feet tall. With that spacing design, you're going to have about 40 feet out of wind roughly on that. If we have a solid windbreak, what you'll see when it's really windy is the cattle will be standing on the upwind side of that solid windbreak, because that's where the most wind protection is, because on the downwind side, we're getting that eddying effect. It's just miserable over there. And that upwind side, the air is being lifted up over that windbreak. There's a kind of a dead zone up against there, but it's very small. Only a few animals can get in there, so it doesn't work. And so, we can use, I see Jeremy's got trees in his background in his picture there. We can arranging trees, hills, topography is fabulous. Just a little bit of a topography can go a long way to protecting these animals when things get cold and windy. Artificial windbreaks. There's some good stuff online from Saskatchewan and Manitoba about engineered portable windbreaks that can be picked up with forks on a skid loader or payloader tractor, whatever, and moved around. And again, then the beauty of the portable is it turns it into another management tool. You're going to have a higher concentration of animals there, so you can use that to either facilitate vegetative management or to facilitate fertility distribution as part of your management. And if they're completely portable, you can move them throughout the course of the winter. I was on a ranch outside of Bismarck, North Dakota a few years ago, and they actually strategically placed their bales inside of a portable pen on a ridge top, and then they fed out from there. Now, they did a lot of unrolling. That's great. That's worked for them. But those bales and where they parked it made this beautiful windbreak, and they changed because there was such rolling topography, they changed where that windbreak was every year so they could move that fertility around. Little more labor intensive than just putting, sisal twine bales out there and cutting them loose for 60 days. But they were achieving their goals. And so get creative with this stuff. Think about how to make it best to use. And there's no one size fits all for your farm or ranch. You can change things up depending on where you're at.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I think that in my experience, the fastest way to improve ground is to feed on it and even unrolling hay. But the most long-lasting way to improve ground is bale grazing. It's slower because it's a smaller, more concentrated area, but it lasts a lot longer, and those compounding and cascading benefits continue to show themselves longer into the future. Does that match with your experience?
That does match with my experience. And I think the previous podcast I was on, we talked a little bit about hay bombing, where it's very high density. It may be 100 to 200 bales per acre. And that has the longest lasting effect, fertility wise, soil aggregation wise, improved bricks in those forages, double to triple the yield. But you have to be very intentional with those areas because it is such a small area, like you said. So yeah, you can really do a lot with feeding hay.
So yeah, Jeremy, let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of these different strategies, when you would employ the certain ones and when you would avoid them, and what, kind of how you pick when you're going to use one of these strategies versus another one. And so, yeah, some of the ones we talked about, of course, bale grazing or pre-placing bales, grazing cover crops, grazing stockpile, other things, that we've mentioned as well. So just kind of talk to me about some of the ways that you think about when are we going to do what, where.
So how we make the decision, first off, is what our hay resources are, or our feed resources, because we do stockpile as part of that feed resource, what stage of lactation our cows are in, what the weather is coming into, and then also how much snow cover we have. So, we'll graze stockpile as long as possible. And I want those animals, I don't want to overgraze those areas, but we'll take it down, let's say 6 inches. But then those fields have the most rest next year. So part of that decision process when we stockpile is what was that previous year's treatment in that field. So we're always trying to think past long-term, past short-term, and then what the future is going to bring. So we'll graze stockpile until we can't go any further. Then we'll turn into some type of bales, whether it's high density or low density bale grazing. And then, watching the manure on the cattle and their body condition really determines when we feed bale silage versus dry hay and what quality of hay we feed. And then also balancing in the impact that we want to have on the soil. If we know it's a hay field, then we're going to unroll hay if at all possible, so we don't over impact that area and make it rough for hay equipment. But if it's just our pasture and we want to build fertility, or it's a hillside that's degraded, then we'll hit it with some pretty intense bale grazing.
Sure.
So,
yep. And what do you think, Kent? Anything else to add there? Kind of advantages and disadvantages and the different strategies and how you choose one over another?
Yeah, think through your context, think through what you're trying to achieve, think through kind of the layout of your farm or ranch and how it can work. I think you're going to get so excited about what you see after time. We've got to give this rest going into the spring. It needs time to recover. We've got to give it adequate rest. And if it looks a little rough, don't panic. That's okay, because if you get rain that spring, and sometimes we don't, and things don't go so great, but most of the time we do. And when it does, you're going to get so excited. You're going to wonder, wow, what more can I do with this? So keep an open mind, know all the whole spectrum of options, keep in front of you. Think about how it can work. Like Jeremy said, pre-plan where you want to go with this and use it as a very, very powerful management tool across your farm and ranch.
Yeah, I think that, thinking about your goals, right? Are we trying to improve this ground, or are we trying to reduce the diesel fuel that it takes to get through the winter? Some of those things are going to help you determine a lot of what your approach is going to be. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And we can accomplish multiple goals in one shot. That's the beauty of outwintering, is not only are we feeding animals, we're spreading manure if we're doing it well. And I've seen sites that it looks better than, a good Artex will do spreading manure. It's just fabulous out there. We're getting these animals some exercise, getting them in condition for the upcoming spring calving season. If we're spring calvers, and we're facilitating soil health and building fertility on sites that have struggled for us in the past. It's just an absolute beautiful system. And so, yeah, think about having your goals, but go ahead and have multiple goals, because you can do it with this system, with a variant of this system.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles and practices has only grown. And there are two primary reasons for that. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who've been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. I always pick on hay, making hay. There's diesel fuel, cutting it, raking it, baling it, grouping it, stacking it, moving it, and feeding it, right? And then if you're feeding in a concentrated area, there might be diesel burned, piling the manure, loading the manure, and spreading the manure. So there just becomes this huge, never-ending cycle of burning diesel fuel to get this done, where the cattle can do all of that for us if we're willing to think about it differently and be strategic, and so I think that we just keep adding to the ways that we burn diesel fuel to get hay to cattle, and we can cut so much of that out. I have one friend in particular. He puts only puts sisal twine in half of his baler, and then he just kicks the bales out and leaves them there, and that's where they bale graze. So that's all there is to it.
You go.
And
that's great.
Right.
If we can feed back out on where we take our hay, that's one of the most beautiful ways to cycle carbon. And that's one of the biggest things we lose. When we're constantly taking from field A and we're feeding back in a lot, we're mining carbon off of that site. We need to be cycling carbon because carbon is the energy that's going to drive that microbial system. It's going to build more biomass. It's just going to help our whole system function better. And so the less we can spend rearranging this stuff, the better off we're going to be. Working with a farm in central Minnesota here the last couple of years, and he started outwintering. He stockpiles as long as he can. He does some covers, grazes that as long as he can, and then he moves into bale grazing. He's using less than 20% of the fuel he used to use feeding his cattle now. Just that alone is phenomenal. Plus, I think we should take a minute here and talk about what our potential fertility losses are when we're feeding on concrete or we're feeding in a yard. Jeremy, you look like you wanted to say something there. Maybe before I go down that rabbit hole or rabbit trail there, you want to complete a thought there.
Real quick, as part of an adaptive grazing system, is that haying and feeding that hay back on the field can be another disruption to push the whole system forward that isn't always looked at rather than just continuous hay removal. So, as part of your whole adaptive grazing system, looking for more disruptions to drive it forward, this is one of those. So.
Well, and I was in a room full of young ranchers in Deadwood, South Dakota a few years ago, and Gabe Brown was there, and one of the speakers that spoke before Gabe got up and asked, how many of you believe that there is a climate issue in our world? And it might have been phrased even more differently than that, but Gabe's hand was the only one that went up, and he got up and he said, what I really want to say is that what we have is a carbon issue in our world, and it's most agricultural acres in America, it's a lack of carbon on the soil that is able to be used by the underground microbiology, and we exacerbate that issue with our hay making practices. And what we have perfected is industrial scale and industrial efficiency carbon removal in our haymaking process, and we are way too good at it, and it shows in those landscapes where we have so much bare ground and we have to replant those fields every so often to keep them continuing to produce enough to make it worth even going over it. I know a lot of guys that'll quit making hay, they won't quit making hay until it's less than a bale or a half a bale to the acre, and we're talking 1,300 pound bales, and they'll make hay all the way down to 600-700 pounds per acre of production, and that's a pretty expensive bale, I would guess, by the time you get all the diesel burn that we talked about. So if we can get the carbon back on that soil and start making those improvements and stop exporting it, then we're covering, no pun intended, we're covering a lot of ground in making up a lot of ground in our in a economics way, right? There's huge economic benefits here. You talk about 80% fuel reduction at $4 a gallon. That doesn't take very long to add up to
plus hours on the machinery, right, and the cost of parts and the cost of replacing that machinery.
And your time.
You take that tractor you're going to wear out in 5 years and stretch it out to 20 years. Right. I mean, what does that mean for the, a lot of us still see 40/20s and stuff running around on farms. My gosh, those things are 60 years old now, we're pushing 60 years old. And they were a good machine and whatever. I'm just picking on it because it's a good example. But if we could keep our other machine going for that long, what would that mean to the bottom line on the farm?
Right. And what's your time worth?
Yeah. And exactly.
And winter should be that time for planning and reflection and looking on the business, looking ahead. And we should take advantage of that, but it ends up being a time when we spend a lot of time.
It's a battle
working for our cows rather than our cows working for us.
And it can be a battle when the weather's bad. It stinks. I mean, I don't know anybody who's too excited to get up when it's 35 below zero and the wind's screaming 30 miles an hour out of the northwest. Oh boy, I get to go out and feed hay after I figure out how to get the, whatever piece of equipment I'm going to use running today going. And it's like, if we could do that in advance, knowing the weather forecast and and get some of that stuff done on a decent afternoon where it's not a battle. I mean, just quality of life completely changes at that time too. Yep. We talked about the carbon nutrient loss, but what about our NP and K? loss. That's huge. There was some work done in the 90s that when we feed cows on a dirt lot, we're losing 90% of our nitrogen, and we're losing upwards of 100% of our potassium from when it leaves the cow until it gets to the field via manure spreader, slurry tank, or whatever. Even when it goes into a pit and over concrete, we have huge nutrient losses between the cow and the field. Well, if we put some dollars to that, it's scary. But if she's out there, and she's laying on where that bale was 3 days ago, they've eaten most of it down. And, normal university loss is 15% of the bale. That's what everybody figures. Okay, that's putting carbon down. Fabulous. It's going to be some bedding for the cow.
Waste in bale grazing is the point. The point is to waste the hay.
Yeah.
Intentional.
It's putting carbon, but then it becomes this huge diaper. So that cow's laying on there. She's been laying on there for the last 4, 5, 6 hours. She stands up. What she's going to do? She's going to stretch, and she's going to poop, and she's going to pee on a carbonaceous material that's going to absorb that. We also know from research in the 90s that even if she urinates on frozen ground, that urine will penetrate up to 2.5 inches. We are capturing over 95% of the potassium in that system, even on frozen ground. And a third of the nitrogen coming out of that cow in urine is coming out in the form of urine. And there's no carbon to tie it up there, at all. But we're still hanging on to the lion's share of it. When it's coming out of manures, there's some carbon tied to it. It ties the nitrogen up and blah, blah, blah. We're okay. But if we just did the math, and I don't have that handy, we could sit and do it if we wanted, but, just the amount of NP and K that we're putting where we want it, if we're strategic about our outwintering. And we didn't, like you said, we didn't have to start up a whole nother line of equipment come spring or summer and get it done. And you know what? We've all been on operations that there's that pile that gets scraped up in the spring or in the summer when it's dry enough. And it's been sitting there for 25 or 30 years, and it's got, nylon twine in it. It's never going to get spread. Let's just face it. It's not, there's tens of thousands of dollars of fertility sitting there that somehow we've been okay with for the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And we're willing to write the check, for something for the co-op to bring the spreader buggy out to do on our, hey, come on, guys. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford to do that and stay in business.
Yep. And that NP and K loss you're talking about volatilizes, right? It's just gone.
Volatilizing and leaching, particularly, the nitrogen's going to go up or down, and the phosphorus is just gone, leaching away. And, we're losing other stuff too, but those are the biggies that we write checks for. So,
Jeremy, you got something to say there, but first I want you to give you an opportunity to talk about
the fertility value of, I believe it was a ton of hay was anywhere from $75 to $100 a ton, just for NP and K, not alone the carbon or the micros.
Right. Yeah.
So retaining that on your farm is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what we're talking about, another way to look at what we're talking about is people first wintering, right? I've talked about people first grazing before, where we don't make our grazing systems so complex that they're miserable to manage. And I think that our winter feeding systems can be the same way, right? They can be so difficult and, hard and dangerous, right? We all know people who've gotten lost between the barn and the house in a blizzard, sometime in the 30s, 40s, whatever, and so I mean,
or between the skid loader and the bucket,
right? Yeah, yeah. So there's literal danger there too. So I mean, we can look at this. I think, Jeremy, we can look at this as a people first wintering, right? Because it's not always pleasant to be outside in the winter. Right.
Yeah. Well, one comment to throw in here while we're talking fertility, I've hardly ever seen an empty manure spreader break. So, talking people first, keeping stress down farming is always important. And, at least in my book, anytime I've been around a manure spreader, it causes stress.
Many years ago, I was heading to some relatives. I believe I can't remember if it was New Year's Day or Christmas Day. Driving down the road, it was just shy of being a blizzard. It was a miserable day out there. And I drove by an old timer who was no longer farming. and the manure spreader broke down in the middle of the field. And he was out there with a pitchfork unloading it. And it was nasty, cold, miserable. And that's when it always happens. And it's like, you want to stop and say, there's another way, and it would make your life so much better. You could be inside right now enjoying the holiday with your family instead of out here shoveling manure out of the manure spreader before it freezes. Wow. But those are the choices we make. And we want people to enjoy what they do. We want them to have quality of life. We want them to be safe, and we want them to make money. And that's why we get, excited about the opportunities that outwintering brings to the farm, whether it is a beef or a dairy or even a sheep. Sheep are great outwintering beasts. They come with a wool sweater and everything, and they hardly use any water. I mean, it's utterly amazing. They're great little outwinterers.
Yeah, so. I'll never forget the time we were sitting just talking after church one Sunday, and one of the deacons at the church looked outside and it was snowing. He's like, "Oh, good, I don't have to worry about watering my sheep." It's snow is their water, I mean,
outstanding. And
I
think a lot here too.
Yeah, a lot more cows get by on a lot of snow more than we think they can, right? That's another water source, winter water source for cattle.
It's fun to watch them use it. Some of them literally have a pattern to go about how they're eating it. It's almost like artwork sometimes. Or like somebody painting a wall. Some of them are pretty good at it and pretty meticulous about how they do it. It's kind of fun to watch.
Yep.
We've been talking a lot about the outwintering and using hay, and I don't want to miss in our discussion that we're not talking about necessarily adding more hay or putting more stored feed up. This is about being efficient and effective in using the stored feed we need to get through the season, and obviously to make money in operation. The less machinery, the less diesel fuel between the feed and the cow, the more profitability we are going to have. And if we do need it, let's make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck out of it. And so we're not talking about, stepping aside from good grazing management and doing a good job on those pastures. That's still a key point of this also, because that gets good manure distribution, good livestock impact, a good sequence of compounding and cascading consequences for the positive across the farm or the ranch. And so I don't want that to get lost in the discussion. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and I think that what we've mentioned a number of different strategies, and I can look at them almost like a relay race, right? We're gonna graze stockpile as long as we can. Then we're going to hand that baton off, and we're going to go to, maybe even feeding with the TMR for a month or two. And then we're going to go to bale grazing. And then, we just keep on handing that baton off to the next thing in the strategy bucket. But, I think we've mentioned a lot of the different benefits to all these different strategies. And the one that we should continue to not miss is that fact that they're out there where the fertility is needed and spreading that for us.
Yep. And don't put all your eggs in one basket. We brought that up before, but I know a lot of guys who really just want to focus on the bale grazing because they don't want to be starting machinery up in the winter. I wouldn't put everything out there. I've been doing this for 25 years, and there's been 3 or 4 winters now that things have gotten rough enough that I needed to go to plan B. Have a plan B if things aren't quote unquote normal. If you get into some nastiness, I was out wintering in an area once and we got a boatload of snow and the wind blew and we had drifts that were 5 and 6 feet high. We couldn't get out there. The cattle couldn't get, we knew it was coming. We kept them up close. We had to keep them up close. I think it was 3 weeks or so. And then we had a thaw and then they could go back out there again. But don't put all your eggs in one basket. Be ready for unforeseen things. Keep a portion of your feed back. Okay, so I didn't get it all out, but you know what? You could probably go out there in a day in March after it thaws and put the rest of it out if it looks like, or even in April, because for a lot of us in northern environments, it may be April or May before that pasture's ready. And just a comment on stockpile. If you got stockpile that you don't get to because you get a 15, 20-inch snow event and they can't reach it in the fall, don't lose sleep over it. that's where I would start your grazing next spring. I'm going to let Jeremy talk about that because he's got a really good story about that. But man, that is the place to start the next spring, because if you go out there and dig through that snow, you will see grass taller and sooner than you will in the stuff that got clipped short the fall before.
Sure. Yeah. Jeremy, what do you got to say there?
So our standard, at least locally, the standard hay feeding date is October 15. So our goal is to graze stockpile in the fall until the snow depth is too deep, and that could be as late as December 1st on average. So there we're a month and a half less of feeding hay. And then, Burke Teichert has a saying, you should never really turn out in the spring. They should just already be there. And he really talks about grazing stockpile in the spring. And we set aside a certain percentage of our stockpile to do that. So as soon as the snow starts to melt away, those animals are ready for a shift in diet. And if you dig down through the residue, there's some green there already that has grown over the winter. And those cattle will really take off on that stockpile and that new green forage underneath, and it'll be all mixed together. So you can transition those animals into a pasture situation without ever stumbling, on that real high lush growth of scours and ultimately pink eye or foot rot. And it's a very good way to transition into the spring. There's very low stress on those animals.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's a great point. I got myself in trouble one time because I was trying to share something on the Working Cows Facebook page, and it went out on my personal page. And I was trying to just make a joke using the Mandalorian quote, "This is the way," and I said, not having a pasture known by its season of use, this is the way. And that went out on my personal Facebook page, and I had a lot of interaction on that one. But but I think that is the thing, right? We get these, this is the summer pasture, that's the winter pasture. Well, that's a tough, that becomes a pretty tough from a diversity perspective, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of what we've talked about here, recently in this episode is adaptability. It is, after all, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, right? And we're going to disrupt. We're not going to do the same thing on every acre every year. And so I think that this is part of that too. We're adapting to whatever the year, and, having that plan B that you talked about, Ken, in place, that you can go back to some area and keep animals safe, because that is part of this too as well. Now, I think a lot of times we feed for our own emotional benefit, right? Because we feel bad for them and we think that must be miserable. Well, they've adapted over thousands of years to being here in this environment, and so maybe they're not as miserable as we think they are. But I think that there's some of that goes into it too. Just
there is, and it's finding animals that work in your system.
Yep.
I've seen a mixed group of animals come out of the winter in mixed condition, and it goes back to breed and epigenetics and how we've treated those different animals over the years. I'm not going to name breeds because I don't want nasty mail coming to you, Clay. So, but I've seen animal, we kind of fed for the middle line or the middle group, and they came through fine. And there was a bunch of animals that were of another breed that came out fat as pigs. And there were some others that came out a little short on the body condition side. And it's like, you're going to find the animals that are going to work in those systems, but they're also the animals that are going to work in your bigger grazing system too. And so, getting your epigenetics moving in a direction that's going to work in your system is going to be a huge part of the long-term profitability of your operation.
Yeah.
And some aren't, they're bred for the confinement barn, and that's a whole different story. But, we can do a lot with, especially, you brought up the dairy piece. There's a lot we can do with dry cows and heifers, and that's pretty powerful. And that's we don't in dairy often think about the cost of keeping those animals. It just sort of gets lost in everything else, and we get all wrapped around the axle about our cows, and that's important. That's fine, but these other animals can cost us a lot of money if we're not careful. And outwintering is a great way to go to help keep the cost of that down. It can be utterly huge. One of our colleagues grazing cover crops here a couple winters ago was grazing those animals. His cost per day, including labor, was 61 cents per head per day on seeded annuals. And most people are pushing the $3 mark, $2.60 to $4 that we've heard as high as $8 in some situations for keeping dry cows during the wintertime. That's a big change. And even if you can only do that for 30 days or 60 days out of the winter, that's going to have a very positive impact on the bottom line. So, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can mix and match and pair and make it fit your context, but don't totally disregard it because you can't do it for everything all the time.
Right. Yeah. The most profitable ranches, I think, according to the Ranching for Profit benchmarks, are feeding less than half a ton of hay per animal per year, and so that's not saying they're not feeding any, and I think that we need to, be okay with that too.
It's a tool. Stored feed, hay, baleage, it's a tool. And if we think of it as a tool instead of a necessary evil, if you will, and use it like a tool to its maximum capacity, but because it's an expensive tool, let's think about ways how to keep that at a minimum.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeremy, what are some of your favorite things that you've seen or that you have been able to implement with regard to this outwintering topic?
So what we have learned is Murphy's Law is well and prevalent in our operation, right? Anything that can go wrong will. So we keep 2 loaders. So that's not a panic if one breaks down. We also keep a field of hay, or try to keep an area that field is set aside for if a loader goes down or somebody's sick or whatever, those animals can be turned in there and have feed. We place our silage hay strategically close to where we want to feed. So when we're baling silage hay, that tube's close so we don't have a lot of transportation cost in that hay. And one of the other things I like to do is buy undervalued hay. So out west, that would be the top and bottom bales out of the big square bale stacks. Here, it's 2 or 3 year old hay that there's more spoilage on it because it's been stored outside. But I want that hay for the carbon and the nutrients in that to get that out there. So per animal, we're feeding way more tons of hay than we should be. But I also know the benefit of getting that carbon back on the soil. So we only may be paying $40 to $60 a ton for hay, and we're getting extra value out of that. So that's one of the things I really like, and also knowing that we can tie those nutrients back into the soil nutrient cycle.
I think there's been 3 things that we've mentioned here today that have all been 80% savings, right? $40 a ton for hay would be an 80% savings over what I'm hearing in my neighborhood this year. We've talked about an 80% fuel reduction, and then you talked about an 80% reduction in the cost of wintering cattle. 60 cents a day is 80% less, I think, according to my cowboy in my head math, than $3 a day, right? So, I mean, when you start talking about 3 things that are all separate pieces of what would be a normal outwintering or a normal winter bill for and you're talking 80% savings in all 3 of those areas, I mean, the dollar signs start to add up, right? I toured one ranch and the guy said, when your salary becomes the biggest line item in your ranch's budget, people start to analyze your performance a lot more than they did before. And so then you have to really make sure that you're a manager that's deserving of that. But he said, used to be feed was our biggest line item in our budget every year. Now it's my salary. And I think that's another thing that we have touched on, but should be noted is the time. Are you paying yourself for the time you spend out there feeding? There's another cost that is also associated with this wintering, and another cost that can be saved or invested in other ways, and in doing more important work than just being out there unrolling hay or however your feed system generally looks. So I think those are some big things that we've definitely touched on. Anything else that really comes to mind that you thought, this needs to be said today before we before we point towards wrapping up here?
I
Go
would
ahead,
just add
Jeremy.
one more thing. We hit epigenetics a little bit, but what we have seen, the animals that can overwinter well end up being the most efficient and most cost effective. That compounding cascading effect of not being hard on them in the winter, but exposing them to the elements and make them work for a living proved to be a more profitable animal throughout their lifespan because they breed back, they graze efficiently. They're just a better animal to have on the farm.
And I think that's, one of the aha moments that I've had throughout the course of the Working Cows podcast is that when you supplement the herd, you supplement the animals that don't need it. And that's probably a larger portion of your herd than you realize, as well as the ones that do. And so if you could just figure out a way to not have the ones that do there and forego the supplementation, then you are saving money there as well.
Well, if we could go there a minute, when us and our colleagues get on farms and ranches, one of the biggest things we see is they're overstocked. The 90 plus percent, and I'm being generous, are overstocked. And it's forcing them to spend a lot more money on stored feed, on buying feed, and they're spending a lot of money on those animals that are hard to keep around. And I ran a little math here. If you're in an area, particularly this year, that you're blessed with adequate rain and really good hay crop, and there's a wide swath of the country that has that this year, and simultaneously, we still have these very high cattle prices, particularly cull crop prices. Can we leverage this market to make some serious impact on the bottom line of our operation and our operation going forward? And we can stretch our pastures and position ourselves in the future to buy us some cushion. When I grew up in Western North Dakota in the 70s, and when I was out there, the old timers always liked to go into winter with about 2.5 times the hay they needed for that winter as a cushion, as a buffer, because they knew there was drought years a coming, and sooner or later it was going to show up. And so on the years they could, they always tried to have that 2.5 years going into winter on hay inventory. And so if we leverage some of that old time wisdom with a modern twist, I'd just like to walk through a little bit of an option here. I checked cull cow prices this week in my area, and they range from $1 to $1.50. Okay. And most of the animals went for north of $1.20 a pound. Those are good prices. A lot of us remember 27 cents a pound for cull cow prices. I'm going to use $1.15 a pound to avoid creating too high of optimism here when you get her to the sales barn. But if we have a 1,300 pound cow and we get $1.15 a pound for her, that's $1,495, or just under $1,500 for that animal on the coal market. Now let's take something off for trucking, for commission, for yardage. I put down $175. Okay, I want to make this real numbers. You got to haul her an hour and a half or whatever, and let's get some real numbers. And your numbers are going to be different than mine. Don't. You put your own numbers into this. Don't use mine. I'm just walking you through an example. There's people right now across the Midwest who can get relatively decent dry hay for $60 a ton in the yard. That sounds stupid cheap, and it is crazy cheap. At $1,320. Oh, by the way, if I take that $1,495 and subtract $175, I end up with a check coming for her for $1,320. At $60 a ton hay, just for easy math, I could buy 22 ton of hay and get it in the yard from selling that one cull. Now, we all should have a list of animals that we're willing to let go of at any time for whatever reason: drought, fire, flood, health issue, whatever. It's because they're costing us money, like you said, Clay, to keep them around. Well, at 2,200 ton, at 2,000, that's 44,000 pounds of feed. Let's say we have the standard university 15% waste. That's 6,600 pounds. That leaves me with 37,400 pounds of, quote, feed for those cows. And we're not even doing the nutrient. We're not even figuring the math on the nutrients here. And if we figure a 1,300 pound cow eating 3% of her body weight a day, that's 39 pounds a day. That cow just bought me 954 cow days of feed, that cull cow. If I sold a trailer load, let's say I get 10 on the trailer, all right, just for easy math. That's 9,590 cow days of feed. If I'm feeding a 100 cow herd, that's 95 days of feed that I could sell 10 cows that are costing me a boatload of money right now. Go buy some cheap hay if it's cheap. If I can put it under a roof, great. If I don't have a roof to put it under, I'm going to rent a bale wrapper. And instead of putting 2 rolls of plastic on, I'm going to put 1. I've done this many times myself for a lot of different reasons. And that I bet guys keeping baleage 3 years. Okay. This is dry hay just wrapped with a single roll of plastic just to keep it, just to preserve it, just to hang on to it. You could sit on that stuff for upwards of 3 years. It would still be decent feed. And if you could do that right now with 10 culls that are just trouble for whatever reason, or got bad udders, or don't want to breed back, or whatever, you pick your poison, you have your reasons. And I could put 95 days worth of hay in reserve right now, and my out-of-pocket costs would be nothing. I'm leveraging my assets for a different set of assets to buy myself some cushion. And at the same time, like Jeremy said, I'm buying fertility in if I'm strategic about how I feed that out. This becomes a win-win-win. 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now, I'm going to have better genetics in my herd. I'm going to have some insurance against drought. I'm putting more fertility out if I'm doing a good job of bale grazing. It's just a win-win-win all the way around. And some of us right now are living in a part of the world that we have this super unique opportunity. Now's the time to leverage that as much as we can and build ourselves some cushion and put ourselves in an excellent financial position going forward.
And it's not going to last, right? This opportunity isn't going to last.
No, it's not. It's like, wow, opportunity knocks. Let's jump on it. But you got to know your numbers. You got to know what's going on in the area. You need to be checking cattle markets. You need to be checking hay markets. You need to know what's, obviously if you got to ship it 16 hours, the hay, that's not going to work. Okay. But if it's Jeremy, an hour or 2 away, that you can get it, even 3 or more, it's a huge, huge window of opportunity right now. And you don't even have to get top dollar on those cull cows. I used less than average for this example, and I know a guy who just bought a bunch of 5x5s for $25 a bale, and it's decent stuff.
Trading 10 cows for 90 days of feeding the herd.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
As an insurance policy,
right?
You're just gonna put it under cover, whether it's plastic or tin roof, and sit on it until you need it.
Yeah.
For the next couple of years. At some point, you're going to feed it out. Yes, I get that, but it's trying to get you a little bit ahead of the curve here.
Well, very good. Really appreciate it. And this is going to come out after the Soil Health Academy at Jeremy's place, but always want to keep people. And now that I've been through a Soil Health Academy myself, I can speak more from experience that just we stood in a circle every day, multiple times a day, and just got asked until some people in the group were probably annoyed. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? Tell me what you're observing, but that's such a powerful tool to, as I said earlier, notice what you're noticing. And
yes. Well, if they miss Jeremy's because of the timing, there's another one in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, at the end of September. And that'll be our last one till next year, because we want to be outside in the field in that circle. And that's a little hard to do when it's 30 below and the wind's screaming and nobody wants to be out there. So we like to do it during the growing season, because that's where we teach the power of observation.
Yep. It is very good. So look forward to that very much. This should be out a couple of weeks anyways before that one in Lancaster County. So probably still time to make some plans and get there. And a pretty good time of year to be in Pennsylvania from what I understand. So
utterly gorgeous.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Very good, guys. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Clay. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Very good stuff there with Kent and Jeremy. Appreciate their perspective and their experience, and just long-time practitioners of these things and understanding how to put them into practice in their context, and some of the lessons they've learned from helping other people figure out how to do it in their context as well. So really looking forward to next week's episode. We're going to be talking to Richard and Tina McConnell, longtime educators in the realm of stockmanship and marketing. We're going to focus on the stockmanship piece in this conversation, and we will be focusing on getting momentum started for a cattle drive. And this was just a really practical, helpful discussion. Some of the things that I've been wondering about in my own experience working with livestock and how to do it well really clicked into place as part of this discussion. So I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. Tina, of course, is the daughter of the great Bud Williams, and so learned it right from the source. Her and Richard did, and been teaching it themselves for a long time. So looking forward to sharing that with you, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.